Some wounds never heal, they just teach you how to live alone. Beau Thatcher knew this truth better than most after 10 years of silence in the Wyoming mountains, where the only conversations he had were with the wind and his memories. He trapped animals, chopped wood, and survived each brutal winter with nothing but his fire for company. Then one night, during the worst blizzard in years, a woman collapsed on his doorstep. Clara was supposed to marry another man in another town, but the storm had other plans. Frostbitten and barely alive, she was the first woman he'd seen in a decade. "It's been 10 years since I saw a woman," Beau said, his voice rough from years of disuse. Then he made a simple decision. "You'll be my wife now." But what happens when spring comes and her real husband shows up? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat like a scar against the white mountainside, its chimney smoke, the only proof that life persisted in this God-forsaken corner of Wyoming territory. Beau Thatcher had built it with his own hands 12 years ago, back when he still believed the world might have a place for him. Now it served as both shelter and prison, a monument to his deliberate exile from humanity. He'd chosen this spot carefully, 3 days' hard ride from the nearest settlement, accessible only by a treacherous mountain trail that disappeared entirely under winter snow. The isolation had been intentional. After burying his mother in the churchyard at Pine Ridge, after watching the last person who'd ever loved him disappear into the ground, Beau had saddled his horse and ridden into the wilderness with nothing but his grief and a worn leather Bible that held more pain than comfort. That Bible sat now on the rough-hewn mantel above his stone fireplace, its pages yellowed and brittle from years of mountain air. He hadn't opened it in 5 years, couldn't bear the weight of his mother's gentle annotations in the margins, her faith-filled words that mocked his current existence. Sarah Thatcher had believed in redemption, in second chances, in the power of prayer to heal even the deepest wounds. She'd died believing her son would find his way back to the light. She'd died wrong. Beau stood at his single window, watching snow fall in fat, lazy flakes that would soon turn deadly. At 38, he'd grown into his solitude like a tree growing around a fence, post-scarred, but stronger for the obstacle. His dark hair had gone grey at the temples, and deep lines bracketed his eyes from squinting against mountain glare. His hands, once soft enough to turn the pages of law books, had grown thick and calloused from years of splitting wood and setting traps. He'd been a different man once, a lawyer in Denver, clean-shaven and soft-spoken, who'd believed justice could be found in dusty courtrooms and leather-bound precedents. That man had died the same day his mother drew her last breath, killed by the realization that all his education and proper manners hadn't been enough to save the one person who'd mattered. The wind howled through the pines, carrying with it the promise of a hard storm. Beau had learned to read the mountain's moods like scripture, understanding the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death. Tonight, the air tasted of iron and ice. The barometric pressure had dropped so low, his old bullet wound a caked a souvenir from his last case, when he'd been fool enough to think the law protected those who served it. His daily routine had become ritual over the years. Rise before dawn, check the traps he'd set along the creek bed, split enough wood to keep the fire burning through another night of bitter cold. He spoke to no one, heard no human voice except his own, and had convinced himself this was peace. Not happiness, she'd abandoned that hope long ago, but a kind of resigned tranquility that asked nothing of him beyond survival. The storm that brought Clara Winslow to his door had been building for 3 days, the kind of weather that killed the unprepared and humbled even veteran mountain men. Beau had battened down for a siege, pulling his traps and securing anything the wind might claim. He'd seen storms like this before, white walls of fury that could bury a man's cabin to the eaves and leave him trapped until the spring thaw revealed his bones. Clara had been traveling the freight road to Millfield when the storm caught her party. 25 years old and bound for a marriage she'd never wanted, she'd left her family's Philadelphia mansion with nothing but a single trunk and the desperate hope that a new life might heal the wounds of the old one. Her intended husband, Marcus Whitmore, owned half the businesses in Millfield and had paid her father's gambling debts in exchange for her hand a transaction that made her feel more like livestock than a woman. She'd been traveling with the Hendersons, an elderly couple making the same journey west, when their wagon had foundered in a drift 2 miles from Beau's cabin. The old man had died trying to dig them out, his heart giving out from the strain and cold. Mrs. Henderson had followed her husband into death within hours, leaving Clara alone with 2 dead bodies and a storm that showed no mercy. She'd wrapped herself in every piece of clothing she could find and struck out into the blizzard, following what she prayed was the creek bed that might lead to shelter. Frostbite had claimed 3 of her toes and turned her fingers black before she'd stumbled, more dead than alive, against Beau's cabin door. Beau had been dozing by his fire when the sound came quite a knock, more like something falling against the heavy oak planks. At first, he'd thought it was a branch torn loose by the wind. Then it came again, weaker this time, and with it a sound that raised the hair on his neck, a woman's voice, barely a whisper, calling for help. He'd yanked open the door to find her collapsed in the snow, her lips blue with cold ice crystals frozen in her dark hair. For a moment, he'd thought she was a fever dream brought on by too many years of solitude. Then she'd opened her eyes, the palest green he'd ever seen, and spoken his name, though he'd never told it to her. "Please," she'd whispered, and the word had cut through 10 years of silence like a blade through paper. Beau had carried her inside without thinking, stripping away her frozen clothes with the clinical efficiency of a man who'd once doctored livestock. He'd wrapped her in his warmest blankets and forced whiskey between her chattering teeth, working to save her life, while his mind struggled to process the impossible reality of another human being in his sanctuary. She'd slept for 18 hours straight, her breathing shallow but steady, while Beau sat watch beside his fire and tried to remember how to be around people. His voice felt rusty in his throat when he'd finally spoken to her, the words coming out harsher than he'd intended. She'd startled at the sound, those pale eyes focusing on him with an intelligence that made him uncomfortable. "Where am I?" she'd asked, and her voice carried the educated accent of the East, refined and cultured in a way that reminded him of the man he'd once been. "My cabin," he'd answered, then added with typical mountain bluntness, "You were nearly dead." She'd nodded as if this made perfect sense, then asked the question that would change everything. "Are you married?" The question had caught him off guard. "No." "Good," she'd said, struggling to sit up despite her weakness. "Then there's no wife to object when you marry me." Beau had stared at her, wondering if the cold had affected her mind. "Lady, I don't even know your name." "Clara Winslow," she'd replied with dignity that somehow survived even her dire circumstances. "And I need a husband more than I need propriety." It was then she'd told him about Marcus Whitmore, about the marriage contract that bound her to a man she'd never met, about the desperate bargain that had traded her freedom for her family's financial salvation. She'd spoken without self-pity, stating facts as if they were weather conditions, unpleasant but unchangeable. "I won't go to him," she'd said simply. "I'd rather die in these mountains than live as his bought woman. But if I'm already married to someone else legally married, then his contract is void." Beau had listened to this incredible proposal while snow continued to pile against his windows, sealing them in together. 10 years of solitude had taught him to be suspicious of need, disguised as opportunity, but Clara Winslow's desperation felt genuine. More than that, it felt familiar. He recognized the look in her eyes, the same trapped despair he'd carried when he'd fled Denver all those years ago. "You don't know anything about me," he'd said. "I know you saved my life," she'd replied. "I know you live alone in the wilderness, which suggests you understand the value of freedom. And I know you haven't touched me inappropriately while I've been helpless, which speaks to your character." The pragmatism of her proposal had appealed to him despite himself. A marriage of convenience, she'd called it. Protection for her, companionship for him, nothing more complicated than 2 people agreeing to weather life's storms together. No promises of love, no expectations beyond mutual respect and practical partnership. But as Bo had looked at her sitting in his rough cabin, wrapped in his blankets with firelight dancing across her face, he'd felt something shift inside him, the first crack in the ice that had formed around his heart 10 years ago. Clara Winslow was beautiful, yes, but it was her strength that drew him, the steel beneath her refined exterior that had carried her through the storm to his door. "It's been 10 years since I saw a woman," he'd said, his voice rough with emotion he'd thought long dead. She'd met his gaze steadily. "Then perhaps we both deserve a second chance." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, something warmer than fire had begun to kindle. Bo Thatcher, who'd spent a decade learning to live without hope, found himself wondering if loneliness might finally be coming to an end. Clara woke the next morning to the sound of Bo moving quietly around the cabin, his boots soft against the wooden floor. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that spoke of deep snow and clear skies. She lay still for a moment, taking inventory of her body's complainture. Frost-bitten toes throbbed, her fingers ached, but she was alive. More than alive, she was free. The realization hit her with startling clarity. Somewhere beneath 10 feet of snow lay the wagon that had carried her toward an unwanted marriage. The Hendersons were dead, God rest their souls, and Marcus Whitmore's bride had vanished into the wilderness. As far as the world knew, Clara Winslow had perished in the blizzard. The thought should have frightened her, but instead it filled her with a giddy sense of possibility. Bo appeared at her bedside with a tin cup of coffee, his movements awkward with disuse. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been reborn," she said, then caught herself at his startled expression. "I mean much better, thank you." He nodded and retreated to the safety of his kitchen, where he began preparing what appeared to be his standard breakfast of salt pork and hardtack. Clara watched him work, noting the efficient economy of his movements, the way he seemed to fill the small space without crowding it. 10 years of solitude had carved away everything unnecessary from Bo Thatcher, leaving behind something essential and honest. "About what we discussed last night," she began carefully. "You were half frozen," Bo said, without turning around. "Folks say things when they're that close to dying. No shame in changing your mind now that you're thinking clear." Clara sat up straighter, ignoring the protest from her healing body. "I wasn't delirious, Mr. Thatcher. I knew exactly what I was proposing." He turned then, his dark eyes studying her with uncomfortable intensity. "Marriage isn't something to enter into lightly, Miss Winslow, especially not with a stranger." "What do you know about marriage?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, and she saw him flinch. "Forgive me, that was unkind." "Fair question, though," Bo said, returning to his cooking. "I was engaged once, long time ago, before I came to the mountains." Something in his tone warned her not to press, but Clara had never been good at heeding warnings. "What happened?" She decided a disgraced lawyer wasn't husband material. The words came out flat, matter of fact, but Clara heard the old pain underneath. "Can't say I blamed her." "You were disgraced." Bo was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old shame. "Last case I tried was defending a shopkeeper accused of stealing from his customers. Evidence was thin, but the man had enemies who wanted him ruined. I believed in his innocence, fought hard for him." He paused, staring into the fire. Turned out he was guilty, had been skimming from his till for years, using the money to pay gambling debts. When the truth came out, it didn't matter that I'd been deceived along with everyone else. Folks figured any lawyer fool enough to be taken in by a criminal wasn't worth much. "That's hardly disgraceful," Clara said softly. "That's just human." "Tell that to the good people of Denver." Bo's laugh held no humor. "I lost my practice, my reputation, my fiancé, everything I'd worked for. When my mother died, there was nothing left to keep me there." Clara understood then why he'd fled to the mountains, why he'd chosen solitude over the risk of being hurt again. She'd made a similar choice when she'd agreed to her father's bargain, trading her freedom for the illusion of security. They were both refugees from a world that had failed them. "I have something to show you," she said, reaching for her traveling bag. From its depths, she withdrew a leather portfolio tied with ribbon. Inside were her travel documents, tickets, letters of introduction, and most importantly, the marriage contract that bound her to Marcus Whitmore. Beau examined the papers with a lawyer's eye, his expression growing troubled. "This is a legal document, Miss Winslow. Your signature is binding." "Not if I'm already married to someone else," Clara said. "Bigamy voids the contract automatically." "But you're not married to someone else." Clara met his gaze steadily. "I could be." The words hung between them like a challenge. Beau set down the papers and moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. Clara could see the war playing out in his posture, the part of him that craved companionship, battling against the part that had learned to trust only solitude. "You're asking me to help you deceive a man who's paid good money for your hand," he said finally. "I'm asking you to help me escape a contract I never wanted to make," Clara corrected. "My father sold me, Mr. Thatcher, like a horse or a piece of land. Whatever Marcus Whitmore paid, it wasn't for my consent, it was for my compliance." Beau turned back to her, and she saw something new in his expression recognition. He understood what it meant to be trapped by other people's expectations, to have your choices stripped away by circumstances beyond your control. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. "A marriage of convenience," Clara said, the words coming easier now that she saw he was listening. "I need a husband to void Whitmore's contract." "You need," she paused, searching for the right words, "you need someone to share the burden of surviving in this wilderness. We could help each other. I've been surviving just fine on my own." "Have you been living, though?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she saw it hit home. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to presume." "No," Beau said quietly. "You're right. I've been existing, not living, but that doesn't mean I'm ready to trust someone else with my peace of mind." Clara understood his reluctance. Trust was a luxury neither of them could afford lightly. But sometimes desperation made for strange bedfellows, and they were both desperate in their own ways. "What if we started small?" she suggested. "Let me stay until spring. Help you with the daily work, cooking, mending, organizing. In return, you teach me to survive in the mountains. When the snow melts, we'll both know if this arrangement has merit. And if it doesn't, then I'll disappear into the wilderness, and you can return to your solitude. No harm done." Beau was quiet for a long time, weighing her proposal against his hard-won independence. Clara held her breath, realizing how much she wanted him to say yes. Not just because she needed his protection, but because something about Beau Thatcher called to the part of her that had always felt like an outsider in polite society. "The preacher comes through in spring," he said finally. "Circuit rider named Jameson. If we're going to do this, we'll do it proper." Clara's heart leaped, but she kept her voice steady. "You're agreeing?" "I'm agreeing to try," Beau said. "But understand this. Miss Winslow, marriage is more than just words spoken over a Bible. If we do this, we're promising to stand by each other through whatever comes. Good times and bad, sickness and health, all of it." "I understand." "Do you?" Beau's eyes held hers. "Because once we say those vows, there's no taking them back. Not in the eyes of God, and not in mine." Clara felt the weight of his words settle over her like a mantle. This wasn't just about escaping Marcus Whitmore anymore. It was about choosing a new life, with all the uncertainty and possibility that entailed. "I understand," she said again, and this time she meant it completely. Beau nodded slowly, as if reaching a decision that would change everything. "Then I guess we're engaged, Miss Winslow." Outside, the morning sun caught the snow and set it sparkling like diamonds, and Clara thought it might be the most beautiful sight she'd ever seen. The wedding ceremony took place 3 days later by lamplight, with only the mountain wind as witness. Beau had found his mother's prayer book among her belongings, its leather cover worn smooth by faithful hands, and read the traditional words with a solemnity that surprised them both. Clara wore her traveling dress, brushed clean and mended where the storm had torn it, while Beau had shaved for the first time in months and combed his graying hair back from his face. They had no ring such luxuries, seemed frivolous in the harsh mountain wilderness, but Beau had fashioned two simple bands, from wire salvaged from an old trap. The metal was rough against Clara's finger, but it felt more honest than any gold band ever could. When they spoke their vows, the words carried weight beyond mere legal necessity. "I, Clara Winslow, take you, Beau Thatcher, to be my husband," she said, her voice steady in the flickering light. "To have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do us part." Beau's response came rougher, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "I, Beau Thatcher, take you, Clara Winslow, to be my wife, to protect and provide for, to honor and cherish, till death do us part." When it was done, they stood awkwardly in the lamplight, uncertain how to proceed. They were married now, bound by law and oath, but still strangers learning to share space that had belonged to only one for so long. "Well," Clara said finally, "I suppose I should learn how to be a mountain wife." The transformation began slowly. Clara had been raised in Philadelphia drawing rooms, educated in needlework and French and all the gentle arts deemed suitable for a lady. But she possessed a practical intelligence that served her well in their harsh, new reality. She watched Beau's routines with careful attention, learning the rhythm of survival that had kept him alive through 10 brutal winters. Beau's hunting knife became her teacher in ways he'd never expected. The worn bone handle fit his palm like an old friend, its blade honed to razor sharpness through years of daily use. He'd carved everything from tent stakes to dinner with that knife, and now he found himself teaching Clara its many uses. "Hold it like this," he said, positioning her fingers on the handle as she attempted to skin the rabbit he'd caught that morning. "The blade does the work, you just guide it." Clara's first attempts were clumsy, but she possessed a determination that impressed him. She ruined the first rabbit pelt completely, but by the third one, she was making clean cuts that would preserve the hide for later use. Her hands grew calloused from the work, her nails chipped and stained, but she never complained. "In Philadelphia, I had servants to prepare my meals," she said one evening, as she practiced cutting venison into strips for drying. "I never realized how much skill it required." "Different kind of skill," Beau said, watching her work, "but no less valuable." She looked up at him, a strand of dark hair escaping from the practical bun she'd taken to wearing. "Do you miss it? The civilized world?" Beau considered the question while he mended a tear in his winter coat. "Sometimes I miss the luxury of books, the feel of good paper, the smell of leather binding, but I don't miss the people much." "Not even your fiancé?" The question came softly, without accusation, but Beau felt the old pain twist in his chest. Margaret was a good woman. She deserved better than a man who'd lost his way. "Perhaps," Clara said, returning to her work. "Or perhaps she was too concerned with what others thought to see your true worth." The observation was gentle but pointed, and Beau found it oddly comforting. Clara had a way of seeing through to the heart of things, of finding perspective in situations that had seemed hopeless. It was a quality he was learning to appreciate. Their sleeping arrangements had been a source of awkwardness from the first night. The cabin had only one bed, and though they were married, they remained virtual strangers. Beau had insisted on taking the floor, rolling out his bedroll near the fire, while Clara occupied his bed with obvious discomfort. "This is foolish," she said on their fourth night together, watching him arrange his blankets on the hard wooden floor. "We're both adults, and we're married. Surely we can share a bed without impropriety." Beau paused in his preparations, uncertain. "Clara, I don't want you to feel—" "I feel guilty," she interrupted. "You're sleeping on the floor in your own home because of me. We can manage this maturely." That night, they lay stiffly on opposite sides of the narrow bed, careful not to touch, both pretending sleep while listening to the other's breathing. But by morning, Clara had unconsciously curled against Beau's warmth, and he had instinctively curved his body around hers in protection. They woke that way, neither speaking of it, but something had shifted between them. The nightmares came on the fifth night. Clara woke screaming, her body rigid with terror, her eyes wide and unseeing in the darkness. Beau found her sitting up in bed, trembling violently, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "Clara," he said softly, reaching for her carefully. "You're safe. You're here with me." She turned toward his voice like a drowning woman reaching for shore. "I dreamed I was back in the storm," she whispered. "I could hear Mrs. Henderson calling for help, but I couldn't find her. I kept walking and walking, but there was nothing but snow and wind." Beau gathered her against his chest, feeling the tremors that shook her small frame. "The storm's over. You're warm and safe." "I left them," Clara said, her voice breaking. "They died because I left them to save myself." "They died because it was their time," Beau said firmly. "You survived because you were strong enough to keep fighting. Don't carry guilt that isn't yours to bear." She cried then, deep sobs that seemed to come from some well of grief she'd been carrying alone. Beau held her through it, one hand stroking her hair, the other rubbing gentle circles on her back. He'd forgotten what it felt like to offer comfort to another human being, and the intimacy of it shook him. "I'm sorry," Clara said when the tears finally stopped. "I don't usually—" "Don't apologize for being human," Beau said. "We all carry more than we can bear sometimes." She pulled back to look at him in the dim firelight, her pale eyes searching his face. "What do you carry, Beau Thatcher?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. For a moment, he considered deflecting, returning to the safe distance he'd maintained for 10 years. Instead, he found himself answering with unexpected honesty. "The weight of every mistake I ever made," he said quietly. "Every person I failed to protect, every trust I betrayed through ignorance or pride. Some burdens don't get lighter with time, they just become part of who you are." Clara nodded, as if she understood completely. Perhaps she did. They sat together in the quiet darkness, two damaged souls learning to trust again, while outside the mountain wind sang its ancient song of survival and solitude. Clara's sewing kit became her anchor to purpose in those early weeks of marriage. The small leather pouch contained her mother's silver thimble, spools of thread in various colors, and needles of different sizes, humble tools that had once seemed inadequate for real work. Now they represented transformation, the power to take something worn and make it whole again. She began with simple mending, repairing tears in Beau's work shirts that he'd been ignoring for months. The fabric was rough homespun, far removed from the silk and velvet she'd worked with in Philadelphia, but there was satisfaction in making something useful beautiful again. As her confidence grew, so did her ambitions. "What are you making now?" Beau asked one evening, finding her bent over her work by lamplight. "Curtains," Clara said, not looking up from her careful stitches. "This cabin needs softening around the edges." Beau studied the fabric she was using, one of her own traveling dresses, a deep blue wool that had once been fashionable in Eastern drawing rooms. Now she was cutting it into panels that would cover their single window and divide the sleeping area from the main room. "You don't have to sacrifice your good clothes for this place," he said quietly. Clara paused in her sewing, looking up at him with that direct gaze he was learning to expect. "Those clothes belong to Clara Winslow of Philadelphia. I'm Clara Thatcher now, and I need different things." The simple statement carried profound weight. She wasn't just changing her name, she was choosing to leave behind everything she'd been in favor of who she was becoming. Beau found her certainty both admirable and slightly terrifying. Their daily routines had settled into comfortable patterns. Beau would rise before dawn to check his traps, returning with game that Clara would prepare for their meals. She'd proven surprisingly adept at cooking over an open fire, turning Beau's monotonous diet of salt pork and hardtack into meals that actually tasted like food. Her first attempts at biscuits had been dense as rocks, but she'd persisted until she could produce light, flaky bread that made their simple meals feel like feasts. "My mother always said cooking was an act of love," Clara said one afternoon, as she kneaded dough for their evening bread. "I thought it was just another ladylike accomplishment, something to make me more attractive to potential husbands. I never understood what she meant until now." Beau watched her work, noting the care she took with even their humble ingredients. "What do you understand now?" That feeding someone well is taking care of their body so their spirit can rest. Clara said, shaping the dough into loaves. It's saying, you matter enough for me to take time and effort to nourish you properly. The observation struck Beau with unexpected force. He'd been existing on subsistence rations for so long he'd forgotten that meals could be about more than mere survival. Clara's cooking wasn't just feeding his body, it was healing. Something in his soul he hadn't realized was wounded. Their first real conversation came during a blizzard that kept them cabin-bound for 3 days. With no work to distract them, they found themselves sharing stories to pass the time. Clara told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, about a father who'd loved books more than business, and a mother who'd died when Clara was barely 15. That's when everything changed, she said, darning socks by firelight, while snow piled against their windows. Father never recovered from losing her. He started gambling, then drinking, then gambling more to pay for the drinking. By the time I turned 25, we'd lost everything except the house, and even that was mortgaged beyond redemption. So you agreed to marry Whitmore to save your father? Clara's needle paused in its work. I agreed to marry Whitmore because I was tired of watching him destroy himself with guilt. He blamed himself for Mother's death, you see. She died in childbirth, a baby that didn't survive either. Father thought if he'd been a better provider, could have afforded better doctors. She shrugged. Grief makes people do foolish things. Beau understood that truth intimately. His own flight to the mountains had been fueled by grief as much as shame, grief for his mother, for his lost innocence, for the man he'd thought he was. What happened to the baby? My brother, Clara said softly. He lived 3 days. Just long enough for us to love him completely. She was quiet for a moment, then added, I think that's why Father's death felt like divine punishment to him. He'd failed to protect his family once, he couldn't bear to do it again. But he did fail to protect you, Beau pointed out gently, by selling you to Whitmore. Perhaps, Clara said, or perhaps he gave me the push I needed to save myself. If I'd stayed in Philadelphia, I would have married some suitable gentleman and spent my life pouring tea and making polite conversation. I never would have discovered I was strong enough to skin a rabbit or brave enough to propose marriage to a stranger. Beau found himself smiling at that. You're definitely brave. Possibly crazy, but definitely brave. Coming from a man who's lived alone in the wilderness for 10 years, I'll take that as a compliment. Their shared laughter felt natural, unforced, and Beau realized something had shifted between them. They were no longer strangers bound by convenience. They were becoming partners, two people learning to trust each other with their vulnerabilities. That night, when Clara woke from another nightmare, Beau didn't hesitate to gather her close. She came to him willingly, seeking comfort in his warmth and strength. But this time, when her trembling stopped, she didn't pull away. Beau, she said softly, her hand resting against his chest. What is it? I want you to know this isn't just gratitude speaking. What I'm feeling for you, it's more than that. Beau's heart began beating faster under her palm. Clara, I know we agreed this would be practical, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. A marriage of convenience. But I'm finding that my feelings are becoming decidedly inconvenient. Beau cupped her face in his hands, studying her expression in the dim firelight. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying that somewhere between teaching me to use a skinning knife and holding me through my nightmares, you've become important to me, more important than I expected. You've become important to me too, Beau admitted, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. So important it scares me. Clara leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. Then perhaps we can be scared together. When Beau kissed her, it was gentle at first, tentative, a question more than a declaration. But Clara responded with a warmth that surprised them both, her hands tangling in his hair as she pulled him closer. The kiss deepened, became something hungry and desperate, filled with weeks of growing attraction and carefully banked desire. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their faces flushed with more than firelight. Well, Clara said softly, I suppose our marriage just became a bit more complicated. Beau laughed, a sound he hadn't made in years. The best things usually are. Beau's father's pocket watch had stopped working 5 years ago, but he still carried it every day, its familiar weight, a reminder of the man who'd raised him to believe in honor and hard work. The inscription on the back, worn smooth by decades of handling, read, "To my son, may you always know your true worth." It had been his father's parting gift before consumption claimed him. And now Beau found himself thinking about those words more often as winter deepened and his feelings for Clara grew beyond mere companionship. Time moved differently in the mountains, measured not by clock hands, but by the arc of sun across snow-covered peaks, the rhythm of storms and clear days, the gradual shortening of daylight that marked winter's progression toward its darkest point. Beau had learned to live by nature's calendar, but Clara's presence had introduced a new awareness of momentus, the way lamplight caught the gold threads in her brown hair, the sound of her humming while she worked, the warmth of her hand brushing his as they passed the coffee cup between them. "Tell me about your father," Clara said one evening as they sat by the fire, her mending in her lap, while Beau carved wooden spoons to replace the ones that had cracked in the cold. Beau's knife paused in its work. He rarely spoke of his parents, finding the memories too tender to examine closely. But something in Clara's gentle tone invited confidence. "Samuel Thatcher was the best man I've ever known," he said, resuming his careful carving. "Clockmaker by trade, philosopher by nature. He could fix anything with gears and springs, but more than that, he understood how time worked, not just mechanically, but spiritually." "What do you mean?" Beau set down his carving and withdrew the pocket watch, holding it so the firelight caught its scratched surface. "He used to say that time wasn't something that happened to you, it was something you participated in. Every moment was a choice about who you wanted to be." Clara reached for the watch, her fingers tracing the worn gold case. "It's beautiful. Does it still work?" "Stopped years ago. I probably have the skill to fix it, but—" Beau shrugged, unable to articulate his reluctance to tamper with the last connection to his father. "But fixing it might change it," Clara finished softly. "Sometimes broken things have their own kind of perfection." Her understanding surprised him. Most people would have suggested repair without thinking, but Clara saw the complexity of his attachment. It was one of the things he was learning to love about her, the way she looked beneath surfaces to find the truth underneath. "He would have liked you," Beau said, accepting the watch back from her careful hands. "How can you be sure?" "Because you see people clearly. My father always said the greatest gift was the ability to see someone's potential instead of just their mistakes." Clara's cheeks flushed pink, whether from the compliment or the fire's warmth. He couldn't tell. "Your mother raised you well, too. I can see her influence in how you treat me with respect, even when I'm being difficult." "You're not difficult," Beau said automatically. "I am, though," Clara laughed. "I have opinions about everything. I ask too many questions, and I rearrange your belongings when you're not looking." It was true, Clara had been quietly transforming the cabin, making it more organized and comfortable without asking permission. Beau's clothes were now folded neatly in the trunk instead of draped over chairs. His cooking supplies had been arranged logically instead of scattered wherever he'd last used them. Even his books, the few volumes he'd brought from his old life, were now lined up properly on the shelf she'd cleared for them. "I like your opinions," Beau said. "And your questions. As for the rearranging," he gestured around the cabin, which looked more like a home than it had in 10 years. "I should have done it myself long ago." "Why didn't you?" The question was casual, but Beau sensed deeper curiosity behind it. Clara was always probing gently at the walls he'd built around himself, trying to understand what had shaped him into the man she'd married. "Because making this place comfortable would have meant admitting I planned to stay forever," he said honestly. "Keeping it rough felt temporary, like I was just passing through." "And now?" Beau met her gaze across the small space between their chairs. "Now I'm thinking maybe I've been running from the wrong things." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. Clara set aside her mending and moved to the floor beside his chair, settling against his leg with natural ease. The contact sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with the fire. "What should you have been running toward?" she asked. Beau's hand found its way to her hair, fingers threading through the soft strands. Connection, maybe. Purpose. The chance to be useful to someone again. You've always been useful. You've kept yourself alive for 10 years, in conditions that would kill most men. That takes tremendous strength. Survival isn't the same as living. No, Clara agreed quietly, but it's the foundation for living. You had to learn to take care of yourself before you could take care of anyone else. Her insight struck him with the force of revelation. He'd spent so many years thinking of his exile as cowardice, but Clara saw it as necessary preparation. The skills he'd developed in solitude, patience, self-reliance, the ability to find peace in simple things were exactly what she needed from a husband. "How did you get so wise?" he asked, his fingers still moving through her hair. "Loneliness teaches you to think deeply," she said. "I spent a lot of years watching people from the outside, trying to understand what made them happy or sad, what they were really seeking beneath all their social posturing. And what conclusion did you reach?" Clara leaned more fully against him, her head resting on his thigh. "That most people are just trying to find someone who sees them clearly and loves them anyway." The words settled over Beau like a blessing. When was the last time someone had seen him clearly? Margaret had loved an image of respectability, not the complicated man beneath. His law colleagues had valued his skills, but knew nothing of his doubts or dreams. Even his mother, devoted as she was, had sometimes loved who she hoped he'd become more than who he actually was. But Clara saw his rough edges, his failures, his years of self-imposed exile, and somehow found him worthy of her trust. She'd married him not because he was perfect, but because he was real. "I see you too," he said quietly. "Your strength, your intelligence, your capacity for kindness, even when life has been unkind to you." Clara turned in his arms so she could see his face. "Is that enough? For a real marriage, I mean." "It's everything," Beau said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Everything else we can figure out as we go." Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside their small cabin, warmth bloomed between them like spring flowers breaking through snow. Time might have stopped in his father's watch, but in this moment, Beau felt more present than he had in years. Clara's locket had been her grandmother's, a delicate gold oval that contained a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. She'd worn it every day since her mother's death, a tangible connection to happier times when her family had been whole and hopeful. But lately, she found herself touching it less often, as if the past it represented was becoming less important than the present she was building with Beau. The transformation had been gradual but undeniable. Where once she'd dreamed of returning to Philadelphia's civilized comforts, now she found herself planning improvements to their mountain sanctuary. She sketched designs for a proper garden come spring, mentally catalogued the cabin's storage needs, and considered where they might add a second room when resources allowed. This rough life was becoming not just bearable, but genuinely appealing. "You're thinking again," Beau observed, from where he sat repairing a trap that had been damaged by some large animal, likely a bear, emerging early from hibernation. "I'm always thinking," Clara replied, not looking up from the shirt she was mending. "It's a terrible habit." "What about this time?" Clara set down her sewing and moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered clearing where their cabin sat, like a small island of civilization in an ocean of wilderness. "I was thinking about how strange it is to feel more at home in a place you've lived for 2 months than in a house you occupied for 25 years. Beau's hands stilled on the trap mechanism. "Do you feel at home here?" "More than I ever expected to." Clara turned back to him, studying his weathered face in the lamplight. "In Philadelphia, I was always performing, being the proper daughter, the dutiful lady, the commodity my father could trade for financial security. Here, I can just be Clara." "You were always just Clara," Beau said quietly. "The circumstances were different, that's all." "Were they, though?" Clara resumed her seat, picking up her needle but not immediately continuing her work. "I think I became who I thought I was supposed to be so completely that I forgot who I actually was underneath. It took coming here, learning to survive with my hands instead of my manners, to remember." Beau understood that feeling intimately. His years of solitude had stripped away everything inessential, leaving behind only what was truly him. Clara was undergoing a similar process, but instead of isolation, she was finding herself through connection. "Who are you then?" he asked, underneath all the expectations. Clara considered the question seriously, as she did most things. Someone who likes useful work more than ornamental accomplishments. Someone who values honesty over politeness. Someone who finds more beauty in a well-made meal than in a drawing room filled with expensive furniture. Someone brave enough to marry a stranger to save herself, Beau added. Someone lucky enough to discover that stranger was worth marrying for other reasons entirely. The words hung between them, full of implications neither was quite ready to examine fully. Their marriage had begun as practicality, but was becoming something deeper, more complex. Clara could feel herself falling in love with Beau Thatcher, and the realization both thrilled and terrified her. Love had never been part of her calculations. She'd agreed to marry Marcus Whitmore without it, viewing marriage as a business arrangement that might grow into affection over time. But what she felt for Beau was nothing like the mild warmth she'd hoped to cultivate with her intended husband. This was fierce and consuming, a connection that seemed to reach into her very bones. "I need to tell you something," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Beau looked up from his work, alert to the seriousness in her tone. "What is it?" "I lied to you about why I agreed to marry Whitmore." Beau's hands stilled completely now, his dark eyes searching her face. "What do you mean?" Clara took a breath, steeling herself for honesty. "I told you it was to save my father from his debts, and that was part of it. But the larger truth is that I was afraid of ending up alone. All my friends had married and moved away. My father was drinking himself to death. I was 25 and considered past my prime by Philadelphia standards. When Whitmore's offer came, it seemed like my last chance at security. And now I realize I confused security with prison. I was so afraid of being alone that I was willing to trade my freedom for the illusion of safety." Clara met his gaze steadily. "But being here with you has taught me the difference between being alone and being lonely. I was lonely in Philadelphia, surrounded by people. I'm not lonely here, even when you're gone all day checking traps." Beau set aside his work and moved to her chair, kneeling beside it so they were at eye level. "Clara, what are you trying to tell me? That I'm grateful the storm brought me to your door instead of delivering me to Whitmore? That I'm grateful you were desperate enough or kind enough to marry me? And that I'm grateful every day for the chance to discover who we might become together?" Beau's hand found hers, his calloused fingers intertwining with her smaller ones. "I'm grateful too. More grateful than I know how to express." "Then express it differently," Clara said, her free hand touching his cheek. "Show me." The kiss that followed was different from their previous tentative explorations. This one carried the weight of acknowledged love, the heat of desire, no longer held in check by uncertainty. Clara's arms wound around Beau's neck as he lifted her from the chair, and when he carried her to their bed, she didn't protest or pull away. What happened next was tender and passionate by turns, two people discovering each other's bodies with reverent care. Clara had been told by well-meaning aunts that marital relations were a duty to be endured. But with Beau she found only pleasure and connection, a joining that felt as natural as breathing. Afterward, they lay entwined in the narrow bed, Clara's head on Beau's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow to normal rhythm. The cabin felt different now, charged with new intimacy, transformed from shelter into sanctuary. "I love you," Clara said quietly, the words coming easily now that the barriers between them had fallen. "I love you too," Beau replied, his arms tightening around her. "I didn't think I was capable of it anymore, but you've proven me wrong about a lot of things." Clara lifted her head to look at him, her hair falling like a curtain around them. "What else have I proven you wrong about?" That healing was possible, that trust could be rebuilt, that isolation wasn't the only way to find peace. Beau tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You've given me back pieces of myself I thought were lost forever." "You've done the same for me," Clara said. The woman who collapsed on your doorstep was running away from everything. The woman in your arms now is ready to run toward something better. Outside, the mountain wind sang its eternal song, but inside their small cabin, two hearts beat in harmony, creating their own music of hope and healing. The locket at Clara's throat held memories of who she'd been, but her future lay in the strong arms of the man who'd chosen to love her, not despite her flaws, but because of her courage to change. Spring was still months away, but in the warmth of their shared bed, Clara could already feel winter loosening its grip on her heart. The sheriff's badge caught the morning sunlight like a mirror as the man wearing it rode into their clearing, followed by 3 other horsemen whose intentions were written in the grim set of their faces. Clara saw them first from the cabin window, where she was kneading bread for their morning meal, and her blood turned to ice water in her veins. "Beau," she called, her voice carefully controlled, despite the panic racing through her chest. He emerged from the woodshed, arms full of split logs, and immediately read the danger in her posture. His eyes found the riders, and Clara watched his face transform from morning contentment to the wary alertness of a man who'd learned not to trust unexpected visitors. The sheriff was a big man, thick through the shoulders and belly, with iron-grey hair beneath his hat and pale eyes that missed nothing. His badge proclaimed him legitimate law, but the men with him looked more like hired guns than deputies. Clara recognized the type from her father's gambling associatesmen who solved problems with violence and asked questions later. "Morning," the sheriff called as he reined in his horse 20 feet from their cabin. "I'm Sheriff Dawson from Millfield, looking for a woman named of Clara Winslow. Got reports she might be in these parts." Beau stepped protectively in front of the cabin door, the wood still in his arms, serving as both burden and potential weapon. "You're a long way from Millfield, Sheriff. What brings you up the mountain?" "Missing person case," Dawson replied, his eyes scanning the cabin and surrounding area with professional thoroughness. "Woman was supposed to arrive in town months ago for her wedding. Her intended husband is mighty concerned about her welfare." Clara's hands trembled as she continued working the bread dough, trying to appear occupied while her mind raced through possibilities. Marcus Whitmore had clearly not accepted her disappearance quietly. Somehow, he'd traced her path to Beau's cabin, and now the reckoning she'd hoped to avoid was sitting on horseback in their yard. "Haven't seen any woman matching that description," Beau said evenly. "As you can see, it's just me up here." Sheriff Dawson's smile was cold as January wind. "That's so? Then you won't mind if we take a look around, make sure she's not hiding somewhere, maybe injured and needing help." "I mind plenty," Beau replied, his voice taking on an edge Clara had never heard before. "This is private property, and unless you've got a warrant, you're not welcome here." One of Dawson's companions shifted in his saddle, hand moving casually toward his gun. "Sheriff asked you polite, mountain man. Be smart and cooperate." "I know the law," Beau said, and Clara heard echoes of his former profession in the authority that crept into his voice. "You have no jurisdiction here, no warrant, and no right to search my property." Dawson's eyes narrowed with interest. "You talk like a man with education. Most folks up here barely know their letters." Beau said nothing, but Clara could see tension building in his shoulders. The sheriff was probing, looking for weaknesses, and Beau's obvious intelligence had caught his attention. "Thing is," Dawson continued conversationally, "Marcus Whitmore is a powerful man with powerful friends. When his bride goes missing, people take notice. When evidence suggests she might still be alive, those same people want answers." "What evidence?" Beau asked. Dawson reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a familiar piece of blue fabric. Clara's heart stopped as she recognized it as a piece of her traveling dress, torn away during her desperate flight through the blizzard. Somehow, they'd found it and followed the trail to Beau's cabin. "Found this caught on a branch about 2 miles down the mountain," Dawson said. "High-quality fabric, not the kind of thing a local woman would wear. Trail led straight here." Clara knew the game was up. She could stay hidden and let Beau face whatever consequences Dawson intended, or she could step forward and deal with the situation herself. The choice was no choice at all. She wouldn't let Beau suffer for her decisions. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped into the doorway, chin raised with the kind of dignity her Philadelphia upbringing had drilled into her. "I'm Clara Winslow," she said clearly. "Or rather, I was." Dawson's satisfaction was visible as he dismounted, his men following suit. "Well, well, Mrs. Whitmore, I presume? Your husband's been worried sick about you." "I'm not Mrs. Whitmore," Clara said firmly. "I never married Marcus Whitmore. I married this man instead." She moved to stand beside Beau, her hand finding his arm in a gesture of unity and support. "Is that so?" Dawson's voice dripped skepticism. "And when exactly did this marriage take place?" 3 months ago, Clara replied, "by my choice and of my own free will." "Convenient story," one of Dawson's men sneered. "Woman gets lost in a storm, happens to stumble on a lonely mountain man, happens to marry him instead of keeping her legal obligations." Beau stepped forward, his patience clearly fraying. "My wife's choices are her own to make. She's not bound to marry any man against her will." "Your wife?" Dawson laughed harshly. "You got proof of this marriage? License? Witness? Or did you just decide to call her wife after you found her half-frozen and grateful?" The insult hit its mark, and Clara felt Beau's muscles tense under her hand. But before he could respond, she spoke up with ice-cold precision. "I have proof," she said, reaching beneath her collar to withdraw a folded paper. "Our marriage certificate, signed and witnessed according to territorial law." It was a bluff. They had no official certificate, only the improvised ceremony they'd conducted by lamplight. But Clara had learned that confidence could sell almost any lie, and she delivered the claim with absolute conviction. Dawson snatched the paper from her hands, unfolding it with suspicious eyes. Clara held her breath, knowing the deception would be discovered in seconds. The paper was actually a letter from her Philadelphia lawyer, official, looking enough to fool a casual glance, but useless under scrutiny. "This is a letter," Dawson said after a moment, his voice dangerous. "You trying to make fools of us, woman?" Before Clara could respond, Beau moved with startling speed, knocking the paper from Dawson's hands and stepping between his wife and the sheriff. "I think you've worn out your welcome here." "Beau, don't!" Clara began, but it was too late. Dawson's hand went to his gun, and suddenly the morning air crackled with the promise of violence. "You're interfering with official business, mountain man. That's a crime in any territory." "So is threatening innocent people on their own property," Beau replied steadily. "And I'm guessing Marcus Whitmore doesn't have as much legal authority as he wants people to believe." The accuracy of Beau's guess was written across Dawson's face. This wasn't an official investigation. It was a private mission funded by a wealthy man's wounded pride and desire for possession. "Here's what's going to happen," Dawson said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "The woman comes with us, willing or not. You can watch, or you can interfere and get buried on your own property. Your choice." Clara felt the moment balance on a knife's edge. Beau was outnumbered 4-1, but she could see him preparing to fight anyway, ready to sacrifice himself for her freedom. The realization filled her with fierce pride and terrible fear in equal measure. "There is a third option," she said quietly, her mind working frantically through possibilities. "One that serves everyone's interests." All eyes turned to her, and Clara prayed her desperation didn't show in her face. Everything depended on the next few minutes, their marriage, their life together, possibly their lives themselves. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the scent of coming spring and the promise of change. But whether that change would bring freedom or tragedy remained to be seen. Beau's rifle leaned against the cabin wall where he'd left it that morning, close enough to reach but too far away to grab, without triggering a gunfight he couldn't win. The weight of its absence pressed against his consciousness as he watched Sheriff Dawson's men spread out in a loose semicircle, positioning themselves to control all escape routes from the clearing. "What third option?" Dawson asked, though his tone suggested he was humoring Clara rather than genuinely considering alternatives to violence. Clara's mind raced through everything Beau had taught her about Mountain survival, sometimes the only way out of a trap was to spring it yourself, on your own terms. You want proof of my marriage to Beau? Real proof that will satisfy even Marcus Whitmore's lawyers? I'm listening. Then let's go to Millfield, Clara said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. Let's settle this properly, in front of witnesses, with legal documentation. If my marriage to Beau is legitimate, then Whitmore's contract is void. If it's not, she shrugged with feigned casualness, then I suppose I'll have to honor my original agreement. Beau stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. Clara, what are you doing? I'm calling their bluff, she said quietly, then louder for Dawson's benefit. Unless, of course, the sheriff is afraid that proper legal proceedings might not support his employer's claims. It was a dangerous gamble, but Clara had spent years watching her father navigate the treacherous waters of business negotiation. The key was to appear confident while secretly terrified, to offer your opponent exactly what they claimed to want, while betting they didn't actually want it at all. Dawson's eyes narrowed as he considered the proposal. Clara held her breath, knowing that if he called her bluff, she and Beau were trapped. They had no legal marriage certificate, no witnesses who could testify to their ceremony, nothing but their own word against Marcus Whitmore's money and influence. Interesting proposition, Dawson said finally. But what's to stop you from running again once we get to town? My word, Clara replied simply, and the fact that I'm tired of running. If my marriage to Beau is legal, I want it recognized. If it's not, I want to know that too. Beau moved closer to her, his voice low and urgent. Clara, we can't prove our marriage in court. We have no certificate, no preacher's signature, no witnesses. We have something better, Clara said, meeting his eyes with steady confidence. We have the truth. Beau's expression shifted as he began to understand her strategy. Clara wasn't just gambling on legal technicalities, he was betting on the power of genuine emotion to triumph over manufactured obligation. In a public forum, with witnesses present, their obvious love for each other would be harder to dismiss than any paperwork. All right, Dawson said, though Clara could see suspicion warring with calculation in his face. We'll do this your way, but understand, Mrs. Winslow, if this proves to be some kind of trick, if you try to run or resist when the truth comes out, my patience will be at an end. I understand, Clara said. How long to reach Millfield? 2 days hard riding. We'll camp tonight at Widow's Creek, reach town tomorrow evening. Beau stepped forward, his protective instincts overriding tactical considerations. My wife doesn't ride hard. She's been through enough without. Your wife, Dawson interrupted with heavy emphasis on the first word, will ride as fast as necessary to reach town quickly, unless you'd prefer we transport her another way. The threat was clear, and Beau's jaw tightened with frustrated rage. Clara touched his arm gently, trying to convey reassurance she didn't entirely feel. I can manage, she said. We'll need to pack supplies. You'll need nothing but the clothes on your backs, one of Dawson's men interjected. This isn't a pleasure trip. Then at least let me bank the fire and secure the cabin, Beau said. I won't have animals destroying what we've built while we're gone. Dawson nodded grudgingly. Make it quick. We leave in 30 minutes. As Beau moved to damp down the fire and secure their possessions, Clara found herself studying the men who held their fate in armed hands. Dawson was clearly in charge, but the other three were hired muscle, probably paid enough to follow orders without asking moral questions. That could work in their favor. Mercenaries were motivated by profit rather than principle, which made them potentially negotiable. Sheriff, she said quietly, approaching Dawson, while his men watched Beau's preparations. May I ask how much Marcus Whitmore is paying for my return? Dawson's eyes sharpened with interest. Why? Just curious about my market value, Clara replied with bitter humor. It's not every day a woman learns she's worth a manhunt. Enough to make this trip profitable, Dawson said carefully. Clara nodded as if this satisfied her curiosity, but her mind was calculating furiously. If Whitmore was paying bounty money for her return, it meant he was operating outside official channels. Real law enforcement wouldn't need financial incentives to recover a missing person. This was a private operation, which meant it was vulnerable to private solutions. Beau finished securing the cabin and returned to Clara's side, carrying only his rifle and the small leather pouch that contained his father's pocket watch and a few other precious items. Clara noticed he'd changed into his best shirt, and trousers the closest thing to formal clothes his mountain wardrobe contained. "Ready," he said simply. Dawson mounted his horse and gestured for Clara and Beau to do the same. They had 2 horses between them, which meant sharing a mount or one of them riding double with a captor. Beau immediately moved toward the smaller horse, clearly intending for Clara to ride alone, but she shook her head. "We ride together," she said firmly. "I'm not spending 2 days separated from my husband." "Touching," Dawson said dryly, but he didn't object. Perhaps he thought keeping them together would make escape attempts less likely. Beau mounted first, then helped Clara settle behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist for security. The position allowed them to speak quietly without being overheard, and Clara immediately took advantage. "Do you trust me?" she whispered against his ear. "With my life," Beau replied without hesitation. "Good, because I'm about to risk both our lives on the chance that love is stronger than law." Beau's back stiffened slightly, but he didn't question her plan. After months of learning to trust each other's judgment, he was willing to follow her lead, even into uncertainty. They rode out of the clearing in single file, Dawson in front, Clara and Beau in the middle, the other 3 men bringing up the rear. As their cabin disappeared behind the trees, Clara felt a pang of loss that surprised her with its intensity. That rough shelter had become more than home. It was the place where she'd discovered who she really was, where she'd learned to love and be loved in return. The trail down from Beau's mountain was treacherous, even in good weather, made worse by patches of snow and ice that hadn't yet yielded to spring's advance. Clara clung to Beau's back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, drawing strength from his presence, even as fear gnawed at her confidence. 2 days to Millfield. 2 days to prepare for a confrontation that would determine the rest of their lives. Clara had initiated this gamble based on desperate hope and fragile faith in the power of truth. But now, with mountain wilderness scrolling past them toward an uncertain future, she wondered if she'd doomed them both. Behind them, one of Dawson's men began whistling a tune Clara recognized from her Philadelphia childhood, a lullaby her mother had sung, full of promises about morning light chasing away the darkness. The irony wasn't lost on her. In less than 48 hours, she would discover whether dawn was coming, or if she'd merely traded one form of captivity for another. Beau's hand found hers where it rested against his chest, squeezing gently in silent communication. Whatever came next, they would face it together. It would have to be enough. The marriage certificate in Clara's hands was a hastily forged document that wouldn't survive close inspection, but it was the best they could manage with the resources available in Millfield's tiny courthouse. Judge Morrison, a weathered man who'd seen enough frontier justice to value substance over formality, held the paper up to the lamplight, while Marcus Whitmore paced behind him like a caged wolf. "This appears to be in order," Morrison said slowly, though Clara caught the slight emphasis that suggested he knew exactly what game was being played. "Appears to be?" Whitmore exploded, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "Judge, that document is a fraud, and everyone in this room knows it. That woman belongs to me, according to a legal contract signed and witnessed in Philadelphia." Clara stood between Beau and the judge's bench, her spine straight with the kind of dignity that couldn't be bought or taught. She'd changed from her travel-stained mountain clothes into a dress borrowed from the judge's wife, and the transformation had reminded everyone present that she was a lady by birth, not some desperate frontier woman. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "I have never belonged to you. I was promised to you without my consent by a father, desperate to pay his gambling debts. There is a difference between a contract and a bill of sale, even if you choose not to recognize it." A murmur ran through the assembled townspeople who had crowded into the courthouse to witness the drama. Word had spread quickly about the mountain man and the missing bride, and Millfield's residents had turned out in force to see how the story would end. Whitmore was a tall man, with expensive clothes and the kind of soft hands that came from never doing manual labor. He'd built his wealth through careful investments and ruthless business practices, treating people like commodities to be acquired and managed. The idea that Clara Winslow might actually prefer a rough mountain hermit to his refined offer clearly offended him on a personal level. "You signed the contract," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Your signature makes it binding regardless of your personal feelings on the matter." "I signed under duress," Clara replied calmly, "to save my family from financial ruin. That signature was extracted through emotional blackmail, not given freely." Judge Morrison cleared his throat, drawing attention back to himself. "The question before this court is not whether Miss Winslow's original contract was ethical, but whether her subsequent marriage to Mr. Thatcher is legal and binding." "It's not legal," Whitmore said immediately. "There's no official record, no license, no proper ceremony conducted by ordained clergy. It's a sham designed to void a legitimate agreement." Beau stepped forward for the first time since entering the courtroom, and Clara felt pride surge through her at the quiet dignity he carried, despite his rough appearance. "Your Honor, my wife and I were married according to the common law traditions recognized in this territory. Our vows were spoken in good faith, before God, with the intention of creating a permanent union." "Witnessed by whom?" Whitmore demanded. "Performed by what authority?" "Witnessed by the mountains and blessed by our own commitment to each other," Beau replied steadily. "In frontier territories, marriages are often solemnized by necessity rather than convention. The law recognizes unions formed under extreme circumstances." Judge Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "Mr. Thatcher raises a valid point. Territorial law does provide for common law marriages when proper clergy or civil authorities are unavailable. But it requires proof of cohabitation, shared property, and public acknowledgement," Whitmore's lawyer interjected. He was a thin man with sharp features who'd arrived on the morning stage, clearly imported from Denver to handle legal technicalities. "These people have been living in isolation. There's no community recognition, no witnesses to their daily life as husband and wife." Clara felt the trap closing around them. The lawyer was right. They could produce no neighbors to testify to their marriage, no community members who had accepted them as a married couple. Their isolation, which had been their sanctuary, was now their legal vulnerability. "Furthermore," the lawyer continued, pressing his advantage, "there's the matter of Miss Winslow's mental state when this alleged marriage occurred. She was recovered from near death by exposure, possibly suffering from hypothermia-induced delirium. Any decisions made in such a condition would be questionable at best." "I was not delirious," Clara said firmly, but she could see doubt creeping into Judge Morrison's expression. "Your Honor," Beau said, his voice carrying a note of desperation Clara had never heard before, "my wife came to me of her own free will. She chose to marry me, chose to share my life, chose to build a future together. That choice deserves legal protection." "Choice?" Whitmore laughed harshly. "What choice did she have? Marry you or freeze to death in a blizzard? That's not choice, that's coercion through circumstance." The courtroom fell silent as the weight of his argument settled over the proceedings. Clara felt the walls closing in, felt the future she'd built with Beau, slipping away under the relentless pressure of legal technicalities and financial influence. But she wasn't finished fighting yet. Clara's voice cut through the courtroom tension like a blade through silk, clear and unwavering despite the odds stacked against her. She stepped forward, positioning herself where everyone could see her face, and began to speak with the kind of quiet authority that commanded attention. "Your Honor, may I address the court?" Judge Morrison nodded, perhaps sensing that the real drama was about to unfold. "Mr. Whitmore's lawyer speaks of choice and coercion," Clara began, her gaze sweeping across the packed courtroom. "Let me tell you about coercion. Coercion is a 25-year-old woman being told that her father's gambling debts will destroy the family unless she marries a stranger. Coercion is being treated like property to be traded for financial stability. Her voice grew stronger with each word, years of suppressed anger and frustration pouring out in controlled, precise sentences. But choice is what I exercised when I walked away from that wagon in the blizzard. Choice is what I exercised when I asked Beau Thatcher to marry me. And choice is what I exercise now when I stand before this court and declare that I would rather die than be bound to a man who sees me as a purchased commodity. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Clara saw several women nodding in sympathy. Her words were striking home with people who understood the difference between legal obligation and moral choice. "You speak of proof," Clara continued, turning to face Whitmore directly. "You want witnesses to our marriage? Then let me provide testimony that no document can contradict." She moved to stand beside Beau, taking his calloused hand in hers with obvious affection. "This man taught me to survive when I had nothing but the clothes on my back. He shared his food, his shelter, his warmth, asking nothing in return but honest companionship. When nightmares woke me, he held me until the fear passed. When I struggled to learn mountain ways, he patiently guided my hands until I could do the work myself." Clara's voice softened, but her words carried clearly to every corner of the courtroom. "He married me not because I was promised to him, not because money changed hands, but because we recognized in each other the possibility of genuine partnership. Our marriage certificate may be informal, but our commitment is absolute." She turned back to Judge Morrison, her eyes bright with unshed tears, but her voice steady. "Your Honor, I have lived as Beau Thatcher's wife for 4 months. I have shared his bed, his meals, his daily struggles and small victories. I have taken his name not just legally, but in my heart. If that is not a real marriage, then I challenge anyone in this room to define what is." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Every person present caught up in the raw emotion of Clara's testimony. Even Whitmore's lawyer seemed momentarily speechless. Beau squeezed Clara's hand, then stepped forward to add his own voice to her defense. "Your Honor, I've lived alone for 10 years, convinced I had nothing to offer another human being." Clara changed that. She saw value in a man the world had written off, found strength in what others called weakness. "When she became my wife, she didn't just share my name, she transformed my life." His voice grew rough with emotion, but he pushed forward. "I don't have fancy lawyers or business contracts to support my claim. All I have is the truth that Clara Winslow came to me broken and desperate, and became Clara Thatcher out of love and hope. She's more my wife than any legal document could make her." Judge Morrison looked between the couple, then at Whitmore, then at the packed courtroom, filled with people who had been moved by their testimony. Clara held her breath, knowing that everything depended on this moment. "Mr. Whitmore," the judge said finally, "you speak of contracts and legal obligations, and I don't dispute that such documents have force under law. But this court also recognizes that marriage is more than a business arrangement. It's a sacred covenant between two people who choose to bind their lives together." Whitmore started to object, but Morrison raised his hand for silence. "I've heard testimony from both parties in this alleged marriage. I've seen evidence of genuine affection, mutual respect, and shared commitment. While the technical aspects of their union may be irregular, the substance appears sound." Clara felt hope rising in her chest, but she didn't dare celebrate yet. "Therefore," Morrison continued, "I rule that the marriage between Clara Winslow and Beau Thatcher, while informally conducted, meets the requirements for common law marriage under territorial statute. The union is legal and binding." The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause, but Clara barely heard them. She was focused entirely on Beau's face, on the relief and joy she saw there, on the knowledge that they had won not through legal technicalities, but through the simple power of truth. Whitmore's face had gone white with rage. "This is a travesty," he snarled. "That woman was purchased and paid for." "That woman," Judge Morrison said firmly, "is Mrs. Clara Thatcher, and she has made her choice clear. This court recognizes her right to that choice." Clara turned to Beau, seeing her own amazement reflected in his dark eyes. They had done it. Against all odds, armed with nothing but their love for each other, they had won their freedom. The new wedding rings were simple gold bands purchased from Millfield's only jeweler, but they felt infinitely more meaningful than Clara's original wire ring or the expensive diamond that Marcus Whitmore had intended to place on her finger. Judge Morrison had agreed to perform a proper ceremony in his parlor, with his wife and several townspeople serving as witnesses, transforming their mountain marriage from legal necessity into celebrated choice. "With this ring, I thee wed," Beau said, his voice steady and sure as he slipped the gold band onto Clara's finger. The words carried different weight now, not the desperate practicality of their first vows, but the confident joy of two people who had chosen each other freely and fought for that choice. "With this ring, I thee wed," Clara repeated, her own voice clear and strong as she placed Beau's ring on his calloused finger. Around them, the small gathering of witnesses smiled and nodded, having been moved by the couple's courtroom testimony and their obvious devotion to each other. When Judge Morrison pronounced them husband and wife again, and Beau kissed Clara with tender reverence, the assembled crowd burst into applause. Mrs. Morrison dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief, declaring it the most romantic thing she'd seen in 30 years of frontier living. The new wedding rings were simple gold bands purchased from Millfield's only jeweler, but they felt infinitely more meaningful than Clara's original wire ring or the expensive diamond that Marcus Whitmore had intended to place on her finger. Judge Morrison had agreed to perform a proper ceremony in his parlor, with his wife and several townspeople serving as witnesses, transforming their mountain marriage from legal necessity into celebrated choice. "With this ring, I thee wed," Beau said, his voice steady and sure as he slipped the gold band onto Clara's finger. The words carried different weight now, not the desperate practicality of their first vows, but the confident joy of two people who had chosen each other freely and fought for that choice. "With this ring, I thee wed," Clara repeated, her own voice clear and strong as she placed Beau's ring on his calloused finger. Around them, the small gathering of witnesses smiled and nodded, having been moved by the couple's courtroom testimony and their obvious devotion to each other. When Judge Morrison pronounced them husband and wife again, and Beau kissed Clara with tender reverence, the assembled crowd burst into applause. Mrs. Morrison dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief, declaring it the most romantic thing she'd seen in 30 years of frontier living. The celebration that followed was modest but heartfelt. The townspeople of Millfield, having watched the legal drama unfold, seemed determined to show their support for the couple who had chosen love over convenience. Someone produced a fiddle, another brought out a bottle of good whiskey, and soon the judge's parlor was filled with music and laughter. Clara found herself surrounded by women eager to hear her story, to understand how a Philadelphia lady had found happiness in the mountains with a hermit. She told them carefully edited versions of her journey, emphasizing the practical skills she'd learned and the peace she'd found in simple living. "But don't you miss the city?" asked Sarah Henderson, the blacksmith's wife. "The shops and parties and fine clothes?" Clara considered the question seriously, looking across the room to where Beau was talking quietly with Judge Morrison about territorial law and land rights. Her husband looked uncomfortable with the attention, but was managing the social interaction with more grace than she'd expected. "I miss books," Clara said honestly, "and I miss the luxury of a proper bath whenever I wanted one. But I don't miss the pretense. In Philadelphia, I was always performing, always trying to be what others expected. Here, I can just be myself." "And what about children?" another woman asked with the frank curiosity of frontier life. "Will you start a family?" The question caught Clara off guard, though she realized it shouldn't have. Marriage naturally led to thoughts of children, and she and Beau had been so focused on establishing their partnership that they hadn't discussed the future beyond survival. "Perhaps," she said, her eyes finding Beau's across the room, "if we're blessed that way." As if sensing her gaze, Bo looked up and smiled, not the careful, guarded expression he'd worn for 10 years of solitude, but something open and genuine that transformed his weathered features. Clara felt her heart skip at the sight, still amazed that this good man was hers. The party wound down as evening approached, and Clara and Bo found themselves standing on the courthouse steps, watching the sun set behind the mountains that had become their home. Tomorrow they would begin the journey back to their cabin, but tonight they were content to stand together and reflect on how far they'd traveled from that desperate night when Clara had collapsed in the snow. "Do you regret it?" Bo asked quietly. "Giving up your old life so completely?" Clara thought about the question, turning her new wedding ring around her finger. "I regret that it took desperation to bring me here," she said finally. "I regret the years I spent trying to be someone else's idea of acceptable. But I don't regret choosing you, choosing us, choosing this life we're building together." Bo pulled her closer, his arms settling around her waist with familiar warmth. "I was dead before you came," he said simply. "Not physically, but in every way that mattered. You brought me back to life." "We brought each other back to life," Clara corrected. "I was just as lost as you were, just in a different way." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. The mountains called to them, promising solitude and peace, but no longer the kind of isolation that came from running away. This was the solitude of choice, of two people who had found in each other everything they needed to face whatever challenges lay ahead. "Ready to go home?" Bo asked as the last light faded from the sky. Clara smiled, thinking of their small cabin with its rough furniture and simple comforts, its store of memories and promise of future happiness. More than ready. As they walked toward the boarding house where they would spend their last night in civilization for months to come, Clara reflected on the strange turns that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been Clara Winslow of Philadelphia, trapped by circumstance and other people's expectations. Tonight, she was Clara Thatcher of the Wyoming mountains, free to write her own story with the man she loved. The transformation hadn't been easy, it had required courage she didn't know she possessed, strength she'd had to discover through necessity, and faith in possibilities she couldn't have imagined. But standing here with Bo's hand warm in hers and the mountains calling them home, Clara knew she had found exactly what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Some wounds never fully heal, she thought, remembering her own words from that first desperate night. But sometimes they teach you how to live more fully than you ever thought possible. She and Bo had both been wounded by life, scarred by loss and disappointment and failure. But together, they had learned that healing didn't mean forgetting the past. It meant building a future strong enough to hold both joy and sorrow, hope and memory, love and the courage to keep choosing it, day after day, year after year. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and Clara Thatcher walked toward tomorrow with her husband beside her and her heart finally completely at peace.